Well, thank you very much, Erin King, who I will introduce properly in a moment. Welcome to all of you in Ithaca, in New York City, around the country, and around the world. We're so happy to host this Cornell Institute of Politics and Global Affairs Congressional Study Group featuring the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Congressman John Yarmuth, and Professor Michael Dorf from Cornell. They will also be properly introduced in a moment. Before we begin the conversation, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're not familiar with the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell, our mission is very simple. We exist to deepen discourse and raise understanding, to get under the headlines and beyond the sound bites, and really foster an understanding of late-breaking news. Before we start this program, just an indication of what's coming up. On October 21st at 7 p.m., Congressman Adam Schiff will be discussing his book. It was just released this week, Midnight in Washington. That will be a conversation between Congressman Schiff and myself. November 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, a conversation about voting rights, redistricting, and fair elections with Mark Elias, a very prominent lawyer in the field of voting rights. November 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, a tale of an Afghan interpreter, a conversation with Farid Firdos. He was a sergeant with the United States Army, an Afghan citizen, recruited by the Army to act as an interpreter, served honorably, won the Bronze Star, or didn't win the Bronze Star, but secured the Bronze Star. He was able to leave Afghanistan. His family was left behind. And so we'll be talking to him about his conversations. And then December 1st at 6 p.m. is bipartisanship still possible in Congress? A conversation with a former Republican member of Congress, Peter King, and myself. If you want to register for any of these programs, you can just Google Cornell Institute of Politics, and we'll also provide a link in the chat room. This evening, we're very fortunate to have two experts on the issue of debt, the Congress's role in the debt ceiling, the executive branch's role in the debt ceiling, Congressman John Yarmuth and Professor Michael Dorf. I'm going to begin with Chairman Yarmuth. We served together in the House, and he'll speak for about 5 minutes, just give you kind of an overview on the question, why does the debt ceiling matter? It's been in the headlines, but why is this so important? And then Erin King will lead Professor Dorf in conversation for about 5 minutes. Then we'll open it up to our co-panelists, Erin King, Professor Doug Kriner, and myself. That should take us to about 7:40, and then we'll open it up to your questions. And Erin King will advise you, Erin King Sweeney will advise you on how to pose your questions. Our moderators tonight, Professor Doug Kriner. He is the Clinton Rossiter Professor in American Institutions in the Department of Government at Cornell. His research and teaching interests focus on American political institutions and the separation of powers, as well as U.S. foreign policy and science and health policy. He's the author of 5 books, including most recently, The Myth of the Imperial Presidency, How Public Opinion Checks the Unilateral Executive. Our other second moderator, Erin King Sweeney. She is the Associate Executive Director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell, former Republican town councilwoman in the largest town in the United States of America, the town of Hempstead on Long Island. Notably, Congressman Yarmuth and I served with her father in Congress, former Congressman Peter King. I will begin with a proper introduction of Congressman John Yarmuth. Now, unplanned in this introduction is the fact that he made quite a bit of news this morning when he announced that he will not be seeking re-election to the United States Congress. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And I can tell you that when it came to budget matters and debt matters, no voice was taken more seriously, and I would argue on both sides of the aisle, than Chairman Yarmuth's. He represents Kentucky's 3rd congressional district in the House of Representatives. Now he is in his 8th term. Since 2019, he has served as chairman of the House Budget Committee, also on the Committee on Education and Labor. He's been widely recognized for his work to improve education, expand access to affordable health care, and for his leadership on the American Rescue Plan, landmark legislation to defeat the pandemic and rebuild our economy. Mr. Chairman, on one of the busiest days, perhaps of your entire career, the fact that you are with us this evening, speaking to Cornell University students, alumni, and supporters, I can't thank you enough. Thank you for being here, and tell us why the debt ceiling should matter to us.
Well, first of all, Steve, thank you for having me. You didn't bargain on having a lame duck, a newly minted lame duck in this program, but I still have 15 months to go and look forward to that. And I will say that back in my college days, not necessarily proud of this, but I think the drunkest I have ever been, was ever in college, was at Cornell, at the Yale Cornell football game one day, which I have no recollection of. But I look forward to coming back to Cornell in a much more sober state. First of all, let me say, there are a lot of fundamental questions. And probably before you get to the question of does the debt ceiling matter, the fundamental question is, does debt matter? And I think you would be surprised to hear that there is a great deal of difference among economists and others as to how much the federal debt does matter. As a matter of fact, in February of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, we had a hearing in the Budget Committee, and that was the title of the hearing, Does Debt Matter? We had 4 economists, including Douglas Holtz-Aiken, who was former director of the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, who has been a deficit hawk and pretty conservative economist. And basically all of them said, no, debt doesn't really matter. And we can get into that, but there's I think back to my first days on the Budget Committee back around 2009 and 10, and Paul Ryan was chairman. Paul Ryan became chairman after the 2010 election, and I've been on the committee for that long. And he would throw up all these charts about here's the debt, here's where it's going, and here's all this, and here's what's going to happen if we don't do something about the deficits and the debt. And of course, none of what he has said would happen has happened. As a matter of fact, the whole idea of the Friedman School of Economics about debt and deficits has really been disproven by reality over the last 20 or 30 years. So since I came to Congress in 2007, the debt has tripled. It's gone from $9 trillion to roughly $28 trillion today. And so the conventional way of thinking about this was, if you do that, interest rates will spike, inflation will rise, and the dollar will weaken, and none of that has happened. We have historically low interest rates still. The dollar's vis-a-vis other currencies has remained where it has been for that whole period, for basically in modern times. And with the exception of the pandemic spike in inflation, which we can argue about what the causes are, there really hasn't been much inflation over the last 15 years either. So economists have started to look at this question again. Does debt really matter? If it does, and we can discuss that, the question is, if it matters in the sense that the higher it gets, the more precarious position the Treasury is in, our government is in, then the question becomes, how do you control it? And what's the best way to do that? The CBO, the OMB, the Government Accountability Office have all said the debt ceiling, the statutory ceiling, which was created in 1917, that doesn't control debt. It has no effect on debts and deficits. Again, we can discuss that further, but that's, everybody has realized the debt ceiling and raising the debt ceiling only relates to spending that has already occurred. And right now, Congress continues to authorize and to appropriate funds that will raise the debt limit. A couple of things that have been done in the past to try to eliminate the tension and the pressure of the debt ceiling, of raising the debt ceiling, back in, I think 1979 or 80 roughly, Dick Gephardt had put in a rule that when you appropriated money that raised the debt beyond the debt ceiling was automatically raised. that was in the law until it was changed in the mid-90s sometime. So you basically had an automatic adjustment of the debt ceiling. And then, again, that was repealed. So now we're back in the situation where periodically, and we've raised the debt ceiling roughly 100 times in that period of time since 1917. We go through this brinkmanship in the Congress, which only threatens our financial situation, the financial standing of the government, and so forth. And we're at that brink again. The other proposal that's been made, and I'll close with this, is that Mitch McConnell back in 2011, my senator, proposed that, of course, this was Barack Obama was president, proposed that the president raise the debt limit by himself or herself, and then the Congress could disapprove of that. And obviously he was trying to put the burden on the president to have to do it rather than have to cast a vote on it. And that really is an idea that I think probably makes sense. Brendan Boyle, who's a congressman from Pennsylvania, and I have introduced a bill to essentially do that. It would authorize the Secretary of the Treasury to raise the debt limit by him or herself in this environment, and then the Congress would have the opportunity to disapprove of that. So basically just take the political calculations out of something that everybody in both parties understands we have to do. We cannot default on the debt of the United States, but we run into these ridiculous political manifestations, and that's where we are. So I'll stop there. I'm over my time and look forward to the discussion.
When you are an outgoing member of Congress or a former member of Congress, you learn to speak within 5 minutes or 2 minutes or whatever it is. Suddenly there's a period at the end of the sentence. Well done, Mr. Chairman. Erin?
Thank you. And thank you, Congressman Yarmuth, for being here. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Michael Dorf at Cornell. He has authored over 100 scholarly articles and essays. He is the author of several books on reading the Constitution, the Oxford Introductions to U.S. Law, Constitutional Law, the editor of Constitutional Law Stories, and of No Litmus Test, Law versus Politics in the 21st Century, and Beating Hearts, Abortion and Animal Rights, and is also the co-editor of a Constitutional Law Casebook. Professor Dorf is part of an interdisciplinary research team at Cornell that conducts federal grant-funded research on the relative efficacy of various formats of tobacco warnings. Professor Dorf writes a bi-weekly column for Verdict and posts several times per week on his own blog, Dorf on Law. A graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, Professor Dorf spent the year between college and law school as a Rotary Scholar at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. After law school, he served as a law clerk for Judge Stephen Reinhardt of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and then for Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. Professor Dorf's work as a lawyer has included a constitutional challenge to NAFTA in the DC Circuit, and he maintains an active pro bono practice that chiefly consists of writing amicus briefs in Supreme Court cases. Before joining the Cornell faculty in 2008, Professor Dorf taught at Rutgers Law School and then at Columbia Law School. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to try to take 5 minutes to talk a little bit about the situation that might confront President Biden in the event that Congress is unable to raise, suspend, or best of all, repeal the debt ceiling. But before I do, I just want to say that I agree entirely with Congressman Yarmuth's diagnosis. That is to say, the debt ceiling is an unnecessary statute, and it's an unnecessary statute even if you disagree with him and with me that the current level of national debt to GDP is acceptable. That is, even if you are a deficit hawk and a debt hawk, there's no reason to have a debt ceiling because Congress and the political process are fully capable of controlling the level of debt without the debt ceiling. What the debt ceiling is it's a number, a cap on the amount of debt that the government can issue. But debt, in the absence of that, would simply be the amount that the government borrows, aggregated over time and with interest, in order to make up the shortfall between expenditures and revenues. And so the way I've thought about this, that's a little bit of an oversimplification. The government has certain kinds of obligations that are on an ongoing basis. Others are appropriated each year. In addition to getting tax revenues, there's money from fees. Government can sell property. But basically, what I've worried about over the last decade, since this became politically salient, is that brinksmanship could lead to a situation that Secretary Yellen has, I think, rightly referred to as a catastrophe, in which Congress does not raise the debt ceiling. And the question that I've then pondered as a constitutional scholar is, what would the president do? I first worried about this with President Obama. I didn't worry about it much with President Trump because the Republican Congress had the cooperation of enough Democrats that they raised the debt ceiling. But now I worry about it again with President Biden, especially with the possibility of brinksmanship, that they don't raise the debt ceiling. The conventional wisdom has traditionally been, in those circumstances, the president would simply have to not pay some people, stiff somebody. And together with a colleague of mine who teaches at the University of Florida and is a macroeconomist as well as a lawyer, a fellow named Neil Buchanan, I started to worry about this. And so we wrote a series of articles that ended up mostly in the Columbia Law Review, addressing this question, which we term a trilemma. Everyone knows what a dilemma is. You've got two options, neither of which is very good. A trilemma is when you've got three options, none of which is very good. And the reason we think of this as a trilemma is because all of the relevant powers here are powers of Congress: the power to spend money, the power to tax, and the power to borrow. And what we say is, in a debt ceiling crisis, a circumstance in which the spending minus the taxation and other revenue is greater than the borrowing authority, anything the president might do, including nothing, would be unconstitutional. President can't unilaterally cut funding. That is to say, a debt ceiling crisis is not the same as a government shutdown. In a government shutdown, Congress fails to appropriate money. Here, the money's already been appropriated and spent. The question is, do you make up the difference for ongoing obligations, right? And the president can't just cut spending. Part of the reason for that is that when President Nixon tried to do that, Congress passed a law called the Impoundment Control Act, which we know is constitutional because the Supreme Court, in a case involving Bill Clinton, said the president doesn't have a line item veto, can't just cut spending, especially if Congress hasn't authorized him to do that. So the president can't cut spending. Everybody knows the president can't just impose taxes. And the president can't borrow on his own authority. And so what we said was, well, he can't do anything then, but he's got to do something. And so my view is that if that were to arise, the president's least unconstitutional option, the sort of least bad option, would actually be to violate the debt ceiling statute. Now, I just want to be clear. I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's a terrible idea. And therefore, I really, really, really hope that Congress acts in such a way as to put this issue to bed. I like the idea of delegating the authority to either the Secretary of the Treasury or the President. I like the Gephardt rule. In my ideal world, the Congress would simply repeal the debt ceiling, but I understand that that's difficult to do. I teach constitutional law, and there's a case from 1995 involving a statute called the Gun-Free School Zones Act that the Supreme Court struck down as beyond the power of Congress. You would think after the Supreme Court struck it down that Congress would simply let it die, but they didn't. They amended it in such a way as to maybe make it constitutional. Why? Because it's impossible to vote against something called the Gun-Free School Zones Act, right? Who wants to be for guns in schools? In the same way, I understand why it's politically very, very difficult for Congress to repeal the debt ceiling, because it looks like a vote for uncontrollable debt, but it isn't. And so therefore, I favor one of these ways of getting around that political obstacle.
Professor, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I had my eyes off the professor for a few minutes because I must tell you that I'm getting texts from your colleagues and former colleagues about this program. I do want to acknowledge former members of Congress, John Barrow from Georgia and Carol Shea Porter from New Hampshire, who are tuning in. Also, I hope you don't mind, I took the liberty of texting, we took his name in vain, Congressman Brendan Boyle, and told him that we were having this conversation and that you mentioned his bill. He says, John is great, one of the best people I serve with. I'm sorry to see him leaving. Let's talk about that for a moment if we can. We can't escape that headline. As somebody who made the decision not to seek re-election, I'm curious as to what went into your decision.
Well, Steve, this was purely a function of thinking down the road and saying, you know, I'll be 75 when my term ends, this term ends, and whether I have 5 years left or 10 years left or 25 years left, whatever time I have left, I just want to have more control over it. And that's pure and simply it. It's, you know, everybody wants to draw political implications of, you know, am I convinced that the Republicans are going to take the majority back? And no, I'm not. Actually, I'm much more bullish on our chances next year than a lot of my colleagues are, actually. Because I think without Donald Trump on the ticket, a lot of the seats we lost in 2020, we have a chance of regaining. But that's really all it is, you know? And as I say somewhat jokingly, I knew when the time was right to quit playing pickup basketball, and I knew when the time was right to move from the back tees to the the shorter tees, and this is the right time. So, you know, it's a bittersweet decision because, as you know, Steve, it's a special place, whether you're in the majority or the minority, whether you can accomplish anything significant legislatively or not, when you're with a group of people who are working together in a higher calling. And, you know, some would question that, but, you know, I think Steve would agree that most of us at least think we are pursuing a higher calling. The relationships that develop in that context are just so special and different than you know, kind of your ordinary high school or college friendships, which I have some and love those, but it's I hate to walk away from that. And, you know, every politician has a little bit of ego, and it's tough to walk away from having the forum, the opportunity to be in programs like this, to be on television, to mouth off and say whatever you want to say. And that's tough to give up. But again, it's just a question of wanting. Now, I've got a 2-year-old grandson who is the most special thing in the world, of course. And the idea that I would ever be prevented from being at something that he was doing is so gut-wrenching that, yeah. So it's all a combination of those factors, but there were no political considerations at all. And it's, again, just very personal. And again, I look forward to the next 15 months, and we may be doing, hopefully we can get this Build Back Better Act done, reconciliation bill, and then we'll have an opportunity to do another one next year. And so I look forward to both of those.
Well, John, you know, you talk about that 2-year-old. I also have a 2.5-year-old grandson. And I mean, the thought of, quite honestly, having to get on a plane, say goodbye to him and go to Washington and fight it out all week and then come home and work my district. Forget it. Just, there's no comparison to that hug of a 2-year-old grandson. Anyway, we don't want to get too mawkish in this conversation. So let me ask, and then I'm going to ask Professor Kriner to pose a question. So the decision was made to delay consideration of the debt ceiling until December. John, what happens in December, do you think? Or is it predictable?
Well, it's not really predictable. And I think what you're seeing, and, you know, it's inescapable that I will make a partisan comment here. We've seen a very different Republican Party right now, and a Republican Party that is dead set on just power, gaining power. And, you know, Mitch, I have a little bit better perspective on Mitch today because he called me and was very gracious and nice about my announcement. But he's being totally irresponsible, and so is his party. To say that nobody can let the government, let the United States government default on its debt and then say we're not going to vote to do it is bizarre to me. And particularly when you have the tax cuts of 2017, which have not been paid for yet, because this year there's going to be $250 billion worth of additional debt based on those tax cuts. Next year there's going to be another $250 billion roughly in debt. In 2024 there'll be another $200 billion in debt. So what are they going to do? Say that's not our responsibility? We did that. We did that by ourselves. No Democrat voted for it. So you've never seen that before, or at least I haven't seen that before when we've done this. So question is, we get to the first part of December. What we did this time was essentially authorize another $450 some odd billion worth of debt, and which allows the Treasury to continue to pay bills until that point. And then we're faced with the exact same scenario. What the Republicans want us to do is use the reconciliation process, which is the process by which we can pass a bill in the Senate without a filibuster, with 50 votes plus the vice president, and raise the debt ceiling with that. The rules of reconciliation say you have to specify a figure. We can't just say, what we've been doing is suspending the debt limit, which is different, same impact, but it's different procedure. If you want to use reconciliation, we would have to say, we're going to raise the debt ceiling to $32 trillion, hypothetically. A lot of people don't want to vote on that because that's a campaign ad waiting to happen, even though I think it's questionable as to whether anybody has ever lost an election over a debt ceiling vote. But I think and this is my guess as to what will most likely happen, is because we're not going to get any Republican help. We can't break a filibuster in the Senate. So we will probably use reconciliation, but instead of specifying the $32 trillion, we will raise it by a figure like we just did. So let's say we raise it by $800 or $900 billion, which might be probably will be more palatable to a lot of our members, the Senate members, and you think they're in competitive races. But then all that does is kick the ball down the road once again. And so whenever we get to that number, we're in the same situation. And this is why Professor Dorff's statement is so right. I mean, it would be wonderful to do away with the debt ceiling. By the way, we are the only country in the world that has a debt ceiling that works like this. I think Denmark has one, but it has an automatic increase when your debt goes up, the ceiling goes up automatically. So it's basically non-factor. Nobody else has a debt ceiling. And we did it for a lot of reasons back around World War I. It allowed some more flexibility to pay the war debt. But again, the proposal that actually Mitch McConnell suggested in 2011 that Brendan Boyle and I are pushing now is one solution. The ideal solution, as Professor Dorff mentioned, is just do away with it. But that's a tough political vote.
Professor Kriner, a question, and then Erin a question. Then Erin will instruct everybody on how they can pose questions as well. Doug?
All right, thanks so much, Steve. So Mike, thanks again for your presentation. I really enjoyed the framing of this as ignoring the debt ceiling being the least unconstitutional option that the president might have. But I'm just gonna ask a more boring question, but I saw someone in the chat that sort of asked about the coin, so I can't hold back as a presidency scholar, someone who likes unilateralism too. So the coin, the plain meaning of the text of a 1997 statute would seem to give the Treasury Department the authority to mint a platinum coin of any denomination. So maybe this is a plausible path out of the debt ceiling crisis, putting aside all the questions about credibility of the government that we might have should we cross the Rubicon and do it. However, I don't think anyone could argue that this was Congress's intent when it wrote those words in that 1997 statute. So if a future administration ever just minted the coin to try and make the issue go away, could there be legal challenges on that? And how would courts navigate this difficult area where they've got sort of plain meaning on the one hand of the words, but an opposite interpretation plausibly when you come looking at legislative intent?
Sure. So let me back up a little bit to for any people paying attention who haven't followed this exactly. So I mentioned before there are three basic laws. There's actually a fourth set of laws that's relevant, and those are the laws governing the creation of money, right? So another statute passed by Congress places a cap on the amount of money that the government can effectively print up. Because one way you might get out of this is you might say, well, let's not borrow the money, let's just print the money. But there's actually a cap on the number of dollars that can be in circulation. But as you rightly point out, there's this other fairly obscure statute, which was undoubtedly designed for the purpose of minting commemorative coins that doesn't have a hard cap. And so the suggestion was made about a decade ago that should Congress fail to pass the debt ceiling, one way around this would be for the Treasury Secretary to instruct the mint to mint, and the conventional wisdom goes, to $1 trillion coins made out of platinum. I've seen versions of it in which these are gigantic coins, but in theory, they could be the size of a nickel. And then they would be deposited with the Federal Reserve, which in turn would credit the government with $2 trillion, and presto, you've created $2 trillion additional dollars. And so your question is that really legal? And I think the answer is it depends, right? On, as you say, whether you take the words literally. Now, I think there is some nice sort of political irony here, right, in a Democratic administration turning to the plain meaning of the statute, because in recent years, it has typically been Republican-appointed jurists who have argued for plain meaning of the statutory text over the purpose or congressional intent. But I think that even some of the plain meaning folks might push back. Well, no, plain meaning does not mean literal meaning. So the late Justice Scalia was fond of saying that he's a textualist, but not a literalist. And so you have to take into account context. And nobody in their right mind would attribute to Congress the purpose of having a cap on the number of dollars, which can be circumvented by just minting coins of arbitrarily high value. Nonetheless, I do think that if all else failed, sure, that would be preferable to causing the markets to tank and the global financial crisis. As to whether anybody could challenge it, that's a really interesting question. If the government were not to pay somebody who is owed money, they can challenge that immediately, right? If Social Security recipients get stiffed, they can go into court and say, hey, where's my check? If a federal contractor is stiffed, a bondholder, any of those would go into court. If everybody is being paid, but somebody thinks this platinum coin is somehow undoing things, well, that looks like what our courts call a generalized grievance, and those usually are not the basis for a lawsuit. So I do think that although I don't favor the coin option, I think it's easier just to print the debt, but one advantage of it relative to some other options is it is difficult to challenge in court.
Thank you, Professor. And on to you, Congressman Yarmuth. There's a lot of discussion and concern about rising inflation. What relationship, if any, is there between the debt ceiling and inflation?
Well, that's a great question. I have done a lot of study and had a lot of discussions about something called modern monetary theory, which many of you probably have heard about. And modern monetary theory is that when you have a sovereign currency, as we do, so we borrow and spend in our own currency. There are only about 10 or 12 countries in the world that are in this category. UK is, Canada is, Japan is, so not that many. Obviously, the European Union is not, because they're using a common currency. But when you are in that situation, that you can basically create as much money as you need to create and inject into the economy, the only restraint on you is not the debt that you accumulate. It's the potential for that you're putting more money into the economy than the economy can absorb. So theoretically, we could, if we said we want to give every family in the country a $200,000 voucher to buy a house, we could create the resources to do that. Well, what would happen? Price of housing which is already in short supply, would go crazy, and basically it's self-defeating. So that's the constraint of spending under modern monetary theory. And the question today is the inflation we're seeing, the way the Fed has looked at it, is it transitory or is it foundational? Is it systemic because of money that's gone into the economy? And I think the jury's still out on that. I would argue that most of the inflation we're seeing is because of pandemic-related distortions of the economy. So you have because people were staying at home last year, you had this huge supply, huge demand for computer games and those types of things, all which use computer chips. So the foreign producers of computer chips, and they're basically they're all produced overseas, basically. They started producing all they could for entertainment devices, and then they couldn't produce chips that would go to automobile manufacturers to help run all the electronic systems. And so what's happened is car prices have gone way up because there's a shortage of automobiles. I have 2 Ford plants in my district, and they're continuously on shutdowns for weeks at a time. They're producing cars and then waiting for the chips to come over. But meanwhile, anybody who wants a new car has to go to the used car market or fight for a few new cars that are available, so the price has gone up. Used cars have gone up 25% in recent times. So you've got these kind of distortions that are probably going to end up being resolved. And I've talked to, there's a brilliant economist named Stephanie Kelton. She's written a book called The Deficit Myth. I flog her book all the time because whether you end up agreeing with her theory or not, it will change the way you look at the whole question of the federal monetary system. And I've asked her the question, I said, if the debt is 30 trillion or 10 trillion or 50 trillion, under your theory, does the next dollar have any different propensity to or potential to cause inflation? And she says, no, the debt that you have has already been spent. That's not in the equation. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's a very long answer, but I would say under that way of thinking, no, it doesn't matter how much debt you have as to whether there's inflation. These are the kind of the standard supply and demand issues that occur in cycles regardless of what the debt is. That would be my answer.
Well, thank you for that thorough analysis.
Some people will differ with that.
Erin, would you please give instructions on how our audience can ask questions? Then I'd like to pose a question to Congressman Yarmuth, and then we'll open it up.
Sure will. You can please submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or you can use the raise hand function to ask a live question. Thank you.
All right, so if you do have a question, please follow Erin's instructions. I see we have about 6 already queued up. But John, I'd like to ask you about the prospects for the legislation that you have with Congressman Boyle, legislation that was Mitch McConnell's suggestion. It seems to me that we can get Mitch McConnell, John Yarmuth, and Brendan Boyle together on an idea, like don't even debate it, just pass it. What are the prospects?
You would think. I think that the speaker is very amenable to it. She likes the idea. She's basically concurs with Professor Dorf and me that we've got to do something, either get rid of the debt ceiling or make this kind of a change. So I think we probably pass it in the House. There may be a few blue dogs who might have problems, but Speaker Pelosi knows how to educate members.
That was very diplomatic.
But then again, you face the same situation in the Senate with you've got 2 members at least, and you may have more on that issue, who are going to would be very, very difficult. And unless you had Republican members who went along, maybe you would get Mitch, but I don't think so. I think Mitch is playing this as much hardball politics as I've ever seen Mitch play on the debt ceiling. And I've known him a long time, so prospects of passing in the Senate in the current formulation would not be great.
All right, we have about 20 minutes or so, under 20 minutes. Erin, I'm going to turn it over to you to moderate. I would ask if you would recognize Arnie Herz as our first questioner, and then go from there.
1 second. Which one? Sorry, Congressman.
I'll read it out in the chat.
Okay.
Arnie Herz asks, would the minting of the coin dilute the money supply, thus causing inflation?
I think I can tackle that. And if I may, I'd like to offer a friendly amendment to Congressman Yarmuth's answer to Ms. King-Sweeney's previous question, which is, so Congressman answered the question, what is the debt's relationship to inflation? And again, there are different views about that. But the question, as I understood it, was also, what is the debt ceiling's relationship to inflation? And that connects to this other question. And there the answer is, really, there is none, except perhaps there's a perverse relationship. That is to say, the general, the sort of conventional wisdom is, right, more debt means greater inflation, because that's the relationship that the economists that the congressman was citing want to explode. But the debt ceiling does not control the level of debt, right? The level of debt is the difference, again, it's the difference between expenditures and revenues. That's the same whether you pay that or not. If you don't pay somebody, your debt doesn't go away. You've still got that debt. So what the relationship of the debt ceiling to inflation is more or less the following, right? If Congress fails to raise the debt ceiling and then doesn't pay people, or defaults, that's going to raise the cost of borrowing in the future, which means interest rates are going to go up. Now, when interest rates go up, typically that's recessionary. And so you might say, well, the relation is the debt ceiling will cause recessions, which will control inflation. But that's hardly the way anybody likes to control inflation. So that I think is the sort of economic relationship. As far as the coin goes, minting, it's not as though someone's going to mint these coins and then those coins go into circulation, right? It doesn't create money that circulates, right? Additional circulating money increases the money supply, and if there aren't the goods and services to go to answer that, then that's inflationary. But these coins are just an accounting gimmick to allow the government to pay off its debt. So I don't think that there's any reason to think that minting the coins, which again is not my preferred solution, but it is one of the options. But I don't think there's any reason to think that that would be inflationary.
Thank you. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge former Congressman Henry Waxman from the great state of California. So Congressman Waxman, welcome. Glad you're...
Hey, Henry.
And next up, Cliff Sharman has been very patient. I think Cliff has had his hand raised for about a half hour. So Cliff, you're unmuted. Please ask your question.
Hello, and thank you all. It's a wonderful program. My question is, what happens to interest rates if the people who buy the debt don't want to pay 100 cents for every dollar of debt?
They go up. I mean, right? That's what happens, right? That's why you don't want to get yourself into this situation, right? Because again, my preferred solution is the least terrible, because it's still terrible. If the government is issuing debt of questionable validity, that means that the government's not necessarily going to pay you back, and so you're going to demand an interest premium.
Yeah, this happened about 10 years ago when we were up against the cliff as well, and the rating agencies downgraded the U.S. debt, and interest rates did go up. The market tanked. Market went down 2,000 points in a matter of weeks, 600 and some points in one day. So yeah, that was just the threat of this, and we've seen it a little bit. Not much, but there have been incremental increases in federal and Treasury yields over the last couple of weeks. largely because of just the question of whether we would raise the debt ceiling, or whether we would default.
I have a chat question from Douglas Parker. What about passing a narrow exception to the filibuster rule, exempting increases to the debt ceiling? Might this not be sold to Senators Manchin and Sinema as necessary to avoid a catastrophe?
Well, we could have a whole hour-long program about the filibuster, and specifically about Manchin and Sinema. Yeah, I mean, I think the filibuster has to go. It's undemocratic. It was never anticipated by the founding fathers. It basically is a minority veto device, and the arguments that have been raised to defend the filibuster, that it promotes bipartisanship, have actually been disproven. It's totally the opposite, and this is hostage taking now, and you know, the polling on this is overwhelming. But you got to get Manchin and Sinema at least to agree to do away with the filibuster, or at least change it. And so that's kind of the answer to the question is, it ain't going to happen, but it should, and it should be for a lot of reasons. And I can think of 3 or 4 issues that we want to carve out the filibuster for, this being one of them. But what we ought to do at least is change the burden of the filibuster to the minority. So the minority should have to put up 41 votes in order to stop a piece of legislation. Right now, you can have a vote in the Senate that's 50 to 12, and it does not defeat the filibuster. So you can allow 38 Republicans to take a walk and not put their name on a vote and hold up a bill. And you ought to at least force the Republicans, or the minority, whichever party, to put up the 41 votes in opposition, rather than force the majority to come up with 60 votes. And that doesn't really change the essence of the filibuster, but we should change the filibuster.
I've got another one for you, Congressman, from William Ostertag. How did the motion for disapproval work in 2011? Did 60 senators vote for a temporary measure to allow it?
No, what happened in 2011 was we went up to the brink again. Mitch McConnell proposed that. It never was implemented. What we ended up getting was the Budget Control Act of 2011. Steve, if you were there then, which basically said that in exchange for raising the debt ceiling, we imposed these strict budgetary constraints and what we called sequestration, where there were automatic spending cuts put into play if we didn't reach certain benchmarks. And ultimately, we ended up waiving those. So it ended up not being effective. But it was really, every year, in order to do the things we needed to do to serve the American people, we had to go through all these hoops to avoid sequestration, again, which would have imposed across the board cuts on every bit of spending, on defense, on food stamps, on education, on healthcare, you name it. We've been across the board cuts. It was a really stupid idea. It fortunately just ended, and we finally got passed. It was a 10-year bill. We finally got past it this year.
I have a question from Karen Anderson. Could necessary action on the debt ceiling be incorporated into the big reconciliation bill when it is finalized?
It could be, but under the Budget Act of '74, which created the reconciliation process, we are allowed to have a reconciliation bill exclusively devoted to raising the debt ceiling in any particular year. So we can do one major programmatic reconciliation bill, like we're trying to do with the Build Back Better Act, and which we did with the American Rescue Plan. And then we can do every year one that only deals with a debt ceiling. So that would be the most likely way to move forward because it's the easiest to do. It's the cleanest way to do it. We could do it faster rather than tying up this major programmatic bill with the debt ceiling bill.
Thanks. I have a question from Barry Cutler. As I listen to the congressman, I hear that many in Congress are afraid to pass a law that has no real consequence because it will sound so bad and a negative ad to a public that doesn't understand the issue. Is that right?
Totally right. You nailed it.
That sums it up.
It sums it all up.
Yeah. John, there's a question from a student, actually. You may not know this off the top of your head, but if your staff would let us know, looking for, have you actually introduced the legislation with Congressman Boyle? And so if we can send this in an email at some point, but our student, Anuli Ananya, would like to know the bill number. And
I don't know the number, but we'll
no, I know. I would imagine you don't, but we can get that and share it with our audience. I'm going to ask Emily Anderson to see if we can post this before we end the conversation. Erin, any other questions?
Gee, I think Professor Kriner has one more question about the 14th Amendment.
Yes, thanks, Erin. So Professor Dorf, there are some that argue that to the extent that a debt ceiling crisis risks having the validity of the public debt of the United States be questioned, that the debt ceiling itself might violate the 14th Amendment. Is this constitutional argument convincing?
Yeah, it's not bad. So just for to refresh everyone's recollection, the 14th Amendment adopted in 1868 in the wake of the Civil War, following the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. Its primary goal in Section 1 and Section 5 is to repudiate the so-called Black Codes that were passed in states of the former Confederacy that reinstituted slavery in all but name. And it does that through self-executing provisions of Section 1 and by empowering Congress to pass legislation in Section 5. But in between Sections 1 and 5 are three other sections. And the one that we're focusing on here is Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, which provides, as Professor Kriner said, that the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Now, the primary purpose of that provision was to prevent states of the former Confederacy from refusing to pay Union debt accumulated during the Civil War. And it's pretty clear on the face of it. But this goes back to our earlier discussion about the Platinum Coin Statute. The language is broader than that. It says the public debt shall not be questioned. Nobody really knows what it means to question the public debt, but there was one Supreme Court case in the relatively early 20th century that said, well, pretty much anything that calls into question the government's willingness to pay back money it owes, including, money it's appropriated, is a violation of Section 4 of the 14th Amendment. So insofar as the debt ceiling statute creates these periodic crises, which leads people to worry about the good faith and credit of the United States, then yeah, I think there is a plausible argument that the debt ceiling statute itself is this kind of sword of Damocles that, unlike the sword of Damocles, might actually one day drop, right, is questioning the validity of the public debt of the United States. I should say, in fairness to some people on the other side of this question, some people argue, well, no, not all money that government has appropriated counts as the public debt of the United States. But the Supreme Court case is pretty categorical. And I think it makes sense to treat, Social Security recipients who've been promised their money as at least on an equal footing with people who invest in US treasuries. Otherwise, there's sort of this perverse idea that you're going to pay back the financiers first and stiff, doctors who perform services for Medicare. And as I say, people who are on Social Security disability, veterans. It just doesn't make sense to me that you would prioritize the financial debt over these other kinds of financial obligations.
Can I follow up with a question of Professor Dorf? Because I share your interpretation of your analysis of the 14th Amendment. What would happen if the president said, okay, I'm going to essentially say that the 14th Amendment makes the debt ceiling law unconstitutional, so what happens then?
Yeah, so it depends on when he says that. I mean, the people that I've talked to who have, I haven't talked to anybody in the Biden administration about this, but I've talked to people who have talked to people there. And what they tell me is that the administration is understandably reluctant to say anything like that now or up until the very last moment for fear of taking the pressure off of Congress. Because if the president were to say that, I think the bigger worry is how the markets react and not the legal jeopardy. Again, right? It's very hard to imagine who would have legal standing to challenge the government, selling bonds to people willing to buy those bonds and then paying all of its other obligations. The worry is that the markets demand a very high interest premium, and that itself leads to a financial crisis. So I think that the real issue is a matter of timing, but that's something that the president could do now. It's just that there are political consequences for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, let me commend to everybody's attention the Debt Ceiling Reform Act, which was introduced by Congressman Yarmuth and Congressman Boyle on September 29th. And we urge you to take a look at it. Before we say our fond farewells to our panelists, let me remind folks that on October 21st, we'll be having a conversation with Congressman Adam Schiff about his book, Midnight in Washington, which does an exceptional job, as anyone can imagine, on either side of the aisle of memorializing what happened during the impeachment proceedings of President Trump. We urge you to tune into that. November 9th, Mark Elias on redistricting and fair elections. November 17th, an Afghan interpreter will be talking about his story and his family's story. And then December 1st, Congressman Peter King and myself talking about whether bipartisanship is possible in the US Congress. And why don't we just spend the next 2 minutes? I'm going to ask John Yarmuth to close by actually answering that question. John, is bipartisanship possible in the United States Congress? You've been there for quite some time. Give us, over the next minute and a half, your sense of whether it's possible. And then I'm going to offer to have you come to Cornell as soon as you're ready. We're going to find a way to put you to work with the Institute of Cornell.
I'd love to come back to Ithaca. Yeah.
In a sober state this time.
In a sober state.
Yeah. Is bipartisanship possible, John, in Congress, now that you're leaving?
It's possible. It is becoming more and more difficult to achieve. Mm-hmm. And for one fundamental reason, and again, I'm going to sound highly partisan now, but having spent 15 years in Congress and seen the evolution of the members of Congress and what they do, is they really have no interest in governing. Right now, most of the Republicans in Congress have essentially come to the conclusion that the federal government can't and shouldn't do much of anything except get out of the way, provide for a military and then get out of the way. So that the government has no responsibility for healthcare and education and so forth. And you saw that for 8 years when Republicans won the majority in the House and they said we're going to repeal and replace Obamacare, but they never had any ideas as to how to replace it. So they really have the orientation of that party has really changed, and the environment's gotten far more toxic since January 6th, as you might imagine. That can be corrected, I think, but right now you don't have any you just don't have it's like basically now negotiating with Kirsten Sinema, because you have she won't tell you what she wants to do. She doesn't want to do anything, and but she objects to whatever you want to do, and that's kind of where we are right now. So we did succeed with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, at least in the Senate. We'll eventually get that passed in the House, and we'll get some Republican votes. I think the estimate is we'll get somewhere between 15 and 20. But that's pretty sad when infrastructure has always been an overwhelmingly bipartisan desire and objective. So it's getting tougher and tougher. It's sad, but we've got to have people who care about governing on both sides of the aisle.
Well, you always did care about governing, and you were always able to work on both sides of the aisle. Congress will miss that, but I have a feeling that your voice will continue to be heard. And I can tell you, as a former member of Congress, sometimes you have even more credibility without having to seek re-election and ask people for campaign contributions. So we look forward to hearing your voice. Professor Kriner, thank you for everything you do. Professor Dorf, thank you for your expertise. Erin King Sweeney, thank you as well. Please join us for Congressman Adam Schiff on October 21st. So long, everybody. John, I'll talk to you soon, my brother.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Thank you, everybody. Good to be with you.